It's one of the most perfect songs ever written, a 3-minute time capsule of teenage yearning, so flawlessly crafted it feels less like it was written and more like it was discovered, unearthed whole. It's a sound that has echoed through the decades, championed by rock critics, covered by countless artists, and beloved by anyone who's ever had the good fortune to hear it. It is the work of a band called Big Star, and if you've never heard of them, you're not alone. In fact, you're part of the story. Big Star should have been massive. They had it all: the explosive, radio-ready hooks of Badfinger, the gritty soul of their native Memphis, and the sophisticated, layered harmonies of the Beatles. They were armed with two prodigiously talented leaders, a state-of-the-art recording studio, and a debut album so brilliant, so brimming with perfect power pop gems, that Rolling Stone magazine compared the duo to Lennon and McCartney. They should have been everything, but they weren't. Due to a series of catastrophic misfortunes and music industry malpractice, their masterpiece album landed in stores with a deafening thud of commercial silence. The world simply didn't hear them. The story of Big Star is one of rock and roll's greatest tragedies, but hidden inside that tragedy is another, more personal, more deeply heartbreaking story. It's the story of Chris Bell, the band's co-founder, its sonic architect, and the tortured perfectionist soul who poured all of that light and beauty into the music. He was the man who crafted these joyous, life-affirming anthems, all while fighting a ferocious private war against a darkness that was steadily consuming him from the inside. This is the story of a buried genius, a man who desperately wanted to be a rock star, but whose fragile heart was shattered by indifference. A man who, after his dream died, would find himself so lost in a wilderness of depression, addiction, and spiritual anguish that he would take his own life at the age of 27, leaving behind a handful of transcendent songs and a legacy that would take the world decades to finally recognize. To understand Chris Bell, you first have to understand the time and place that forged him. Memphis, Tennessee in the late 1960s was a city haunted by the ghosts of its own musical glory. This was the hallowed ground where rock and roll had been born at Sun Studio, the city that gave the world Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis. It was the home of Stax Records, the epicenter of gritty, soulful R&B. But by the end of the decade, that golden era was fading. Sun was largely dormant, Stax was heading towards bankruptcy, and the city's vibrant music scene was in a palpable lull. It was into this void that a new generation of Memphis musicians came of age. But these kids weren't looking to the past. They weren't interested in blues or soul. They were looking across the Atlantic. Chris Bell and his circle of friends were die-hard Anglophiles. Their heroes were the Beatles, the Kinks, the Who, and the Yardbirds. They were obsessed with the intricate harmonies, the inventive guitar sounds, and the sharp melodic songwriting of the British invasion. They were, in essence, trying to recreate Abbey Road in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. And incredibly, they had their own Abbey Road. Ardent Studios, founded by the brilliant and generous audio engineer John Fry, was a world-class recording facility that became a clubhouse for this small insular scene of rock and roll dreamers. Fry, who was only a few years older than the musicians themselves, gave them unparalleled access to his state-of-the-art equipment. It was a playground for sonic experimentation, a place where they could spend endless hours trying to replicate the complex production techniques of their British idols. Christopher Branford Bell was the undisputed leader of this scene. Born in 1951 to a prominent and wealthy Memphis family, he was a study in contradictions. He was handsome, charming, and driven by a burning, almost terrifying ambition. From a young age, he was a perfectionist, obsessed with the technical craft of making records. He wasn't just a guitarist, he was a budding producer, a songwriter, and a visionary who heard fully formed symphonies in his head. Before Big Star, he led a series of bands with names like Rock City and Ice Water, featuring his friends and future Big Star bandmates, drummer Jody Stevens and bassist Andy Hummel. These early recordings show his blueprint was already in place: shimmering acoustic guitars, crunchy electric riffs, and soaring Beatles-esque vocals. He had the songs, he had the band, he had the studio, he had everything he needed except for one thing: a true star to front the project. He needed a John Lennon to his Paul McCartney. And in 1971, fate delivered one right to his doorstep. His name was Alex Chilton. Alex Chilton was already a bona fide rock star. As the teenage singer of the Box Tops, he had a massive #1 hit with The Letter, his gruff, soulful voice becoming famous around the world. But Chilton was disillusioned with the music industry. He had been a hired gun in the Box Tops with little creative control. Now back in Memphis, he was trying to find his own voice, playing acoustic folk gigs and moving away from his pop past. Chris Bell saw an opportunity. He knew that Chilton's raw, instinctive talent and his existing fame were the missing ingredients for his own grand vision. He relentlessly courted Chilton, convincing him to join his band. With the lineup solidified, Bell and Chilton on guitars and vocals, Andy Hummel on bass, and Jody Stevens on drums. They adopted a new name, one that reflected their ambitions. Across the street from Ardent Studios was a popular grocery store chain named Big Star. The name was simple, ironic, and full of starry-eyed pop art promise. The period that followed the recording of their debut album, #1 record, was a flurry of creative energy, a magical time when two powerful and very different talents collided. In the sanctuary of Ardent Studios, they spent months crafting the album. Chris Bell was the undisputed musical director. He was the meticulous sonic architect, laboring for hours, sometimes days, over a single guitar tone or a vocal harmony. John Fry, the studio owner, later recalled that Chris would spend 8 hours trying to get the perfect acoustic guitar sound, only to decide it needed to be doubled. He was obsessed with texture, with layering, with creating a sound that was both powerful and pristine. Alex Chilton, on the other hand, was the spontaneous, raw-nerved artist. He brought a darker, more world-weary sensibility to the band, a perfect foil to Bell's bright, optimistic pop leanings. The magic of #1 record lies in this very tension. It's Bell's meticulous production wrapped around Chilton's ragged soul. It's the sound of Bell's perfectly constructed pop world being joyfully scuffed up by Chilton's rock and roll swagger. It's the Ballad of El Goodo, a soaring, hopeful anthem penned primarily by Bell, sitting next to Feel, a blast of raw, desperate energy driven by Chilton. It was a partnership that, for a brief, brilliant moment, was as potent as any in rock history. When #1 record was completed in 1972, everyone involved believed they had a masterpiece on their hands. And they were right. The album was a stunning collection of perfect songs. The reviews were ecstatic. Billboard called it a veritable treasury of pop. Rolling Stone raved. It seemed that everything Chris Bell had ever dreamed of was about to come true. And then came the disaster. This is the great untold trauma at the heart of the Big Star story, the moment that would shatter Chris Bell's spirit permanently. Their record label, Ardent Records, had signed a distribution deal with Stax Records, the legendary soul label. But Stax was in the midst of its own financial and administrative collapse. The deal was poorly managed, and promotion for #1 record was virtually non-existent. Even worse, Stax had trouble getting the albums physically into stores. Copies of this brilliant, critically acclaimed record sat in warehouses, gathering dust. The band would hear their songs on the radio in Memphis, then go to the local record store, only to find that the album wasn't even for sale. It was a logistical and commercial catastrophe. They had thrown a perfect party and nobody came. For Alex Chilton, who was already cynical about the music business, it was a bitter, I told you so moment. But for Chris Bell, the true believer, the idealist who had poured every ounce of his being into the project, it was an absolutely devastating, soul-crushing blow. His perfect creation had been rendered invisible. The world had not rejected his masterpiece. It had been prevented from even hearing it. The failure was so profound, so total, that it broke him. In a fit of despair and rage, he quit the band he had founded. In one legendary tragic incident, he even went to Arden Studios and began erasing the multi-track master tapes of the album. A desperate act of creative self-destruction. The dream was over, and Chris Bell, the bright star, began a long, slow fall back to earth. The years following his departure from Big Star were a wilderness period for Chris Bell. He was a man adrift, stripped of the one thing that had given his life meaning and purpose. The band, his band, continued without him, recording the equally brilliant but much darker album, Radio City. For Chris, watching them carry on was a source of immense pain. He embarked on a desperate search for a new identity, a new anchor for his life. He traveled to Europe hoping to find inspiration and perhaps launch a solo career. He spent time in France, working on new songs with his brother David and recording at the famous Chateau d'Hérouville studio, where Elton John had made Honky Chateau. But the demons of depression and self-doubt followed him. His personality, always intense and perfectionistic, now curdled into something more volatile. His relationship with his brother became strained. He struggled with his sexuality, a source of private turmoil in the less than accepting culture of the time. He fell deeper into drug use, not as a recreational pursuit, but as a desperate attempt to self-medicate his profound emotional pain. He battled addictions to heroin, barbiturates, and downers, all while his depression deepened into a seemingly bottomless despair. One of the most humanizing and heartbreaking aspects of this period was Bell's intense but short-lived embrace of born-again Christianity. For a time, it seemed he had found the solace he was looking for. He renounced his rock and roll past, worked at his family's fast food restaurants, and tried to live a simple, devout life. He spoke with the fervor of a true convert, believing that faith could heal his broken spirit. But it was a fragile peace. The underlying depression, the chemical imbalances in his brain were too powerful. Even his faith couldn't quiet the storm inside him. Through all this turmoil, he never completely stopped making music. In sporadic sessions back at Arden Studios with John Fry and Jody Stevens, he worked on a collection of solo material. These songs, recorded over several years, are a raw, unfiltered window into his soul. They are some of the most beautiful and devastatingly sad recordings in the rock canon. The centerpiece of this work is the song I Am the Cosmos. It is his definitive statement, a desperate, soaring plea to the universe from a man who feels utterly alone and untethered from the world. Over a bed of shimmering ethereal guitars, he sings with a voice that is fragile yet powerful. Every night I tell myself, I am the cosmos, I am the wind, but that don't get you back again. It's a song about heartbreak, but it's also about a profound spiritual crisis, a search for meaning in a world that felt cold and indifferent. Another standout track, You and Your Sister, is a stunningly beautiful and gentle acoustic ballad featuring a string arrangement by his father's friend. It's a song filled with a palpable sense of love and regret, a quiet moment of beauty amidst the chaos of his life. These solo recordings were his private therapy, his attempts to make sense of his pain. He tinkered with them endlessly, a perfectionist to the very end, but he was never able to secure a record deal or officially release them during his lifetime. They remained like #1 record, unheard by the wider world. When looking back at the brief, brilliant flash of the original Big Star, one question has long dominated the narrative. Who was the true creative force? For decades, the legend of Big Star became intertwined with the legend of Alex Chilton. Chilton, after all, continued making music, becoming a celebrated and iconoclastic cult figure in his own right. Because Chris Bell disappeared from public view and died so young, his contributions were often downplayed or overlooked. The story became simplified. Chilton was the genius, and Bell was his talented but troubled partner. But this interpretation, while convenient, is a profound disservice to the truth. The historical reality is that on #1 record, the two were equals, a true partnership of yin and yang. And if one person's vision truly defined the sound and feel of that first album, it was Chris Bell's. He was the producer, the arranger, the obsessive sonic architect who polished their shared songs into pop diamonds. Chilton brought the raw, unpredictable fire, but Bell built the beautiful, sturdy vessel to contain it. He was the George Harrison and the George Martin of the group. Rolled into one, he wrote or co-wrote many of the album's most iconic tracks, including Feel, The Ballad of El Gudo, and My Life is Right. The debate over their roles isn't about diminishing Chilton's immense talent, but about restoring Bell's rightful place in the story. Theirs was not a rivalry in the traditional sense, but a symbiotic, if volatile, collaboration. The tragedy is that the partnership was too fragile to survive the crushing disappointment of the album's failure. Another complex issue is how we understand Bell's mental health through a modern lens. In the 1970s, clinical depression was not a topic of public conversation. It was a private shame, often misunderstood as a character flaw, a bad attitude, or artistic temperament. His friends and family saw his erratic behavior, his mood swings, his reclusiveness, but they lacked the vocabulary and the societal framework to understand it as a debilitating illness. They saw him struggling with drugs, with his faith, with his career, but it's likely that these were all symptoms of the deeper underlying depression that plagued him his entire adult life. He was a man crying out for help in a world that didn't yet know how to listen. This leads to the final painful question, the nature of his death. On December 27, 1978, Chris Bell was driving home from a rehearsal. He was just 27 years old. He lost control of his small Triumph TR7 sports car and crashed into a wooden telephone pole. He was killed instantly. The official ruling was an accident, but to everyone who knew him, who had witnessed his long and painful decline, it was a clear and undeniable act of suicide. His brother David revealed that Chris had been deeply depressed in the preceding days. There were no skid marks at the scene of the crash. He hadn't tried to stop. He had simply driven at high speed into the pole. It was a final desperate act from a man who could no longer bear the pain of living. For years after his death, Chris Bell and Big Star remained a footnote in rock history, a secret whispered among musicians and hardcore record collectors. But the music was simply too good to stay buried forever. In the 1980s, a new generation of alternative and indie rock bands began to emerge, and many of them had one thing in common: a deep and abiding love for Big Star. Bands like R.E.M., The Replacements, The Bangles, and later Teenage Fan Club and Elliott Smith all cited Big Star as a seminal influence. They heard in Big Star's music the perfect synthesis of British invasion melody and American garage rock energy. Peter Buck, the guitarist for REM, famously said, "We've sort of based our careers on the Big Star template." The Replacements even wrote a loving tribute song titled simply Alex Chilton, further cementing the band's cult status. Through these disciples, the sound and spirit of Big Star were resurrected and introduced to a whole new audience. The final piece of Chris Bell's legacy fell into place in 1992, 14 years after his death. Rykodisc, a small independent label, finally compiled and officially released his solo recordings on an album titled I Am the Cosmos. At last, the world could hear the raw, beautiful, and heartbreaking music he had created during his wilderness years. The album was a critical revelation. It cemented his reputation as a singular, visionary artist in his own right, a lost genius to be spoken of in the same hushed, reverent tones as Nick Drake, Tim Buckley, or Syd Barrett. Chris Bell's story is one of rock and roll's most profound tragedies. But it's not the cliched story of rock excess. It's a quieter, deeper tragedy about the collision of a fragile, perfectionistic soul with a commercial world that prizes commerce over art. He was an artist who created music of exquisite, almost painful beauty, a beauty the world was not ready to receive. The indifference he faced was not malicious. It was simply the random, cruel chaos of the music business. And he was simply too sensitive, too invested to survive it. In the end, what are we to make of the life of Christopher Bell? He was a man who yearned for connection, for recognition, for a sign that the immense beauty he was creating was being felt by someone, somewhere. He poured all of his light into his music, and in return he was met with a wall of silence. His story is a devastating reminder that genius is no shield against despair, and that some of the most joyous art can come from the most tormented souls. The ultimate irony, and perhaps the ultimate grace of his story, is that his music refused to die with him. It was too pure, too powerful. It was rediscovered, championed, and loved by generations of artists and fans who heard what the world had missed the first time around. His legacy is not one of failure, but of a strange, delayed, and posthumous triumph. In his most famous song, he cried out to the universe, feeling lost and unseen. He never knew, in his short and troubled life, that decades later, the world would finally listen. And what we hear is the sound of a beautiful, brilliant, and broken heart still echoing through the cosmos.